Yeah, all right, we'll get started. So yeah, thank you for the great introduction, Amin. Appreciate that. Appreciate everything you've done in the community. Min and I did used to work together as well, and we're still good friends, and see one another at 3D Experience World. Hopefully, all of you will be there. I'm looking forward to giving two presentations. In fact, this is going to be one of them. So this is just kind of a practice for that. I've given this presentation many times over the years, and typically have recycled through the same two or three presentations just because the basics are always the hits. This is a great topic. We can just cover exactly what type of programs you have available to write with SolidWorks API and what languages. So let me share my screen. I'm just going to share my entire screen if that's okay, Amin.
Absolutely. Go for it.
Yeah, so that way you can see if I can just switch back and forth between the presentation and Visual Studio. So yeah, I'm just going to use the slides I have from a few years ago. I do have them ready for Houston already, but we'll just do this. So sorry. So macros versus add-ins versus standalones. And what we're going to do is go over the program types you can use with the SolidWorks API, then the languages available, talk about some general recommendations, kind of a summary, reductionistic summary of how you can use the SolidWorks API, because even though there's numerous options, it's really only, I want to say boiled down, there's really only two ways. I think most professional developers are using the SolidWorks API, and then we'll be able to corroborate that as well. And actually, I'll just say it right now. It's either VBA for macros or C# for add-ins and standalones. That's pretty typical. But nevertheless, there's other instances where you might want some other combinations. So we'll discuss what those are. And then yeah, if we have time, we might look at some case studies, just kind of get your brain thinking about how companies might be using it. And as Min said, you can just drop questions in the chat. I will try to look at them, and I'll try to answer them as we go. I want this to be a bit more interactive, not just a stale lecture.
And
And
Keith,
I'm also
if I may
go ahead.
interject, I'll try to
Mhm.
make a list of the questions as you focus. Maybe you get focus on some of the slides. I'll try to make a list of those questions. So for the ones that you don't cover, we'll have some time later at the end of the
Yeah,
presentation.
sure,
That's
sure,
okay.
sure. If I will stay, I'll keep. I will look at it though. This is typical. It's how I normally do the presentation, so it's fine. If anybody has something right away, I'll try to get to it. So, all right, program types. First of all, most of you probably know that the three available are macro, add-in, standalone, and then the languages available are VBA, VB.NET, C#, C++, and VB.NET and C# are both considered .NET languages. They're really the same language. They compile down to the same uh, Microsoft language, if you will. And then VBA is, of course, similar to VB6, and it's written for Microsoft Office products. And then, borrowed or used by SolidWorks Corporation for SolidWorks. So that is a Microsoft technology as well. And then C++, of course, is an old school stalwart within programming world. You can use the SolidWorks API with any language that's COM aware, but not as common to use other ones. I have seen some people try to use it with Python or Java or something like that, but typically not worth trying to go that route unless you have an extremely specific case for it. You're normally just going to stick with these languages. So what are the kind of options between the program types and the languages? So macro, you can do in VBA, as most commonly made in VBA, or you can make a macro with a .NET language, and that is through VSTA macros, which I'm not going to recommend. In fact, I'm so far out of the game, so far removed from VSTA macros. I don't even know if they exist anymore. Maybe a min knows better than I do. They kind of went through a period where they had some relevance, some popularity, but
Yeah.
I don't even know if they're supported anymore. Are they technically supported still, Amen?
I don't think they're used anymore. I think there was a presentation a couple years ago that we went together to the one by Daniel Seaman, if you remember, back in 2018 when he made the recommendation that everybody move everything that's in VSDA to an add-in.
Right.
And
Yeah. And
yeah,
I remember
oh,
that. I just wasn't certain if they were like it was officially deprecated. I don't,
right. I think they are deprecated, or I could be wrong, but something to that we could research for sure.
yeah.
But I don't think anybody's using them anymore for sure.
Yeah. So that's kind of the summary of it. It's like a lot of these options, they might be technically possible, but for one reason or another, they're not feasible, not recommended. And so, yeah, we might even be to the point where I could just put like a kind of a neutral or something for VB.NET and C Sharp under macro. It's technically possible, but not recommended. And then C++, you can outright macros in at all. And then add-ins and standalones, you can use the the three big boy languages, which I know you're on a VBA kick, so I hope I didn't insult you there.
That is true.
But you can only write an add-in or a standalone with .NET or C++. All right, so we'll go over briefly the kind of the pros and cons of some of these, and then I'll just jump into some examples. I'm going to show you code from each of these. I'll show you how they run, what they look like, just using a simple example across the board in which we create a block. Oops, let me go back. So what does the program type affect? And then what does the language you choose affect? The program type, again, going back, I'm talking about macro, add-in, standalone. That's going to affect the integration and flexibility, the ease of development, the ease of distribution and administration, and the performance. And we'll look at specifics of each of these. And then likewise, we'll see how the language affects ease of development, security, and performance. And we'll go one more slide before I actually show you some examples. So no, actually, let's do that now. I'm gonna stop the lecture. We'll just actually get into some code. So I have SolidWorks open here. I think this is, yeah, SolidWorks 2025, and I have Visual Studio here. But let's start with the macro I've written. So I'll show you a macro. I'll show you two standalones, and I'll show you an add-in. Actually, I'll show you the add-in second. So in SolidWorks, you probably know under toolbars, macro, you can bring up your macro toolbar. I like to keep it floating down here. And you have your standard macro recorder options, which I assume most of you are familiar with. I'm not going to run through how to use the macro recorder. You can play around with it on your own. Needless to say, macro recorder is it's not very powerful. In fact, I wouldn't even use the analogy of it being training wheels if you're trying to get into SolidWorks API. It's very, very limited. So occasionally a new programmer might use the macro recorder to kind of discover an API call. Maybe they're struggling to find it in the SolidWorks API help, which actually I can, no, I don't have the SolidWorks API help out there. Where is it? API help. Yeah. So here's the SolidWorks API help. So as you probably know, you can search by topic, by category. And if you're struggling to find an API call, sometimes you can record it, but a lot of times you can't. And then also the code that the macro recorder produces is quite a mess. Just a quick side note, I have always used the local SolidWorks API help. I know there's a web help, but I find the local API help easier to navigate. How about you, Amin? Do you still use the local API help, or have you moved toward web?
I've started using the local API. Well, I used to use the local API help, but because it's not kind of updating every time they add a new API call. I would just use
Mm,
the online one. Everybody has a tendency to use Google these days. It's just kind of automatic, right? So I tend to gravitate towards the search engine. But if I can't find what I need, I know I can always go back to the offline help because it's just easier to navigate. But it's not always like the latest and greatest.
yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, I don't know their update schedule for that anymore. Let's see. My experience, the macro recorder is of little use as it records pics, which is yeah, I agree. So it can record a lot of unwanted code. It's very messy. It's not even really that useful for creating a starting point to build off of. So once you decide to get serious at all about the SolidWorks API, you're really going to be writing pretty much everything from scratch as a VBA macro, and that's fine. That's what you want. So if you're kind of dipping your toe into the world of SolidWorks API, just kind of prepare yourself. That's the expectation. You're going to just have to learn how to write code from scratch. And oh, while we're on that topic, actually, for the past few years, I feel like the AI capabilities with regards to the SolidWorks API are not that strong. But Amin, maybe you've played around with it more lately. Would you say that AI is to the point where someone could use it to learn the SolidWorks API, or not quite?
Um, I would probably say no, but it's a good starter to generate. It's definitely better than the macro recorder, but it's not quite there. You still need to go through the documentation. You still need to go through the forums. You still need to go through the courses out there, such as yours, for example, in CADSharp LLC.
Mm,
There are a lot of resources out there besides AI that could point you in the right direction, but it's definitely better than the macro recorder. I'll say that. It's getting better every day,
okay.
slowly.
Okay. Yeah. So not huge leaps forward, but that's kind of where I think I'd say it's been for a few years now. It is a tool. AI is a tool, but of course, if you're hoping it's going to allow you to just turn off your brain and vibe code, as the
Just to
kids say, it's
interject here quickly, in my experience with the GPTs and all of the different AIs like the Gemini and all, they still
mhm,
hallucinate quite a bit. So they'll
mhm,
make up methods that actually don't exist in the API, and that can
exactly.
drive you mad.
Yeah, that's in general, that yeah, that's always been a frustration regarding AI for me. I probably use AI less than the average techie, just because yeah, hallucination really annoys me. It really annoys me when AI pretends a method exists that it doesn't. So I have had that experience in the past. Anyway, as Amin mentioned, I know he has a SolidWorks API course. I have one on CADSharp.com, which you all might be aware of. Whatever you want to use. This one is about 15 hours long, just walks you through everything. A lot of it's free. A lot of people have used that over the years to learn SolidWorks API, but in general, expect to have to get your hands dirty. Expect to have to learn really three things. You're going to have to learn some of the language itself, of course. You're going to have to learn how to navigate the SolidWorks API hierarchy through the API help, and you're going to have to grasp how accessors work. How you go from one pointer to another within the SolidWorks API. And so in this case, in this macro I have open, which I'll do that one more time. I went down to the macro recorder, edit macro. It's an SWP file. It's actually compiled, by the way. It's not just a text file, and it can only be open in the SolidWorks VB editor. I have a main module. It's going to show a user form. It's going to let us input the dimensions for a block and create the block. When we click create block, it's going to do some calculations to make sure that the values are in meters, which is system units. Yeah, because I specified enter it in millimeters, and then I'll put it in meters, convert it to meters. And then once we're in here, the kind of meat and potatoes module called create block, you see got passed in those three values. And we're declaring our variables, we're setting those variables, basically obtaining the pointer, and then we're doing something with those variables. And whenever I teach my beginner API presentation at 3D Experience World in Houston, we're going to go through all of that. We're going to go through, if you want to really, really, from the ground up talk on how to use SolidWorks API, we'll cover all that. We're not going to cover that here. But anyway, this is the meat and potatoes function. And again, it'll be the same through the macro I show you, the add-in I show you, and the standalones I show you. That similar structure. And very generally, see I've added comments, but it's pretty intuitive. First part is we'll get the template, and it's a good thing I added this code in here because over the years I've done this presentation on so many different machines, had SolidWorks installed in so many different places. Can't be relying on hard-coded paths. That's awful programming practice. And then you don't do that anymore, do you?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay. Just wanted to check there. Then we're going to open a new document with that template path. Then we'll select the XZ plane, which what is that? Is that the top plane? I don't even know. But we'll then traverse the feature tree until we find, a feature that is of type ref plane. We will select it, and then we'll insert a sketch. We'll create a center rectangle. It's going to start, the first three arguments are the center point, and then the next three arguments are whatever corner needs to be out there in space. And then lastly, we will do our feature extrusion, which of course has a ton of arguments. Actually, this is an old method of feature extrusion. I'm pretty certain they're up to actually let's find out just for fun. No, actually they're not that much further along. Or it might be under a different interface now. But as you can imagine, over the years, they add new API calls as new functionality gets added to SolidWorks. And that doesn't mean the old ones are deprecated. They might be technically obsolete, but they're not deprecated. And that's an important point because, as a min will also tell you as a professional developer, it's not always necessary to use the latest and greatest API call. That's just sometimes unnecessary. Makes your code more complicated or long than it needs to be. So as you can imagine, those correspond to all the options of a feature extrude. And here's what happens when we actually run this. We could go back to our main module, by the way, and run it, or we could go to the run macro button. It doesn't matter. And we'll get the user form to pop up because the entry sub procedure is this sub procedure. All right, so we'll just put in 555 arbitrarily, click create block. And I tested this last night and it better work. All right, it does. Otherwise, we'd have to do a debugging session there on the fly.
That would be fun.
You know, it always is fun, and done that at least once in a SolidWorks World presentation. It's kind of entertaining. So there's our block. This is going to be the same thing across all these program types. So that was macro. Let's do the add-in now. And if I go back to the folder that contains all of my examples, which, by the way, if you don't want to wait until 3D Experience World to see this presentation again or the other one I'm going to give, I always keep all of my common 3D Experience World presentations at cadsharp.com/3DXW. And I mean, these are literally the three I've just keep recycling through. Also, I've given them at many SolidWorks user groups. So always feel free to come here and you can watch a video from past SolidWorks World or 3D Experience World and then get the files and play around with all of this yourself. I'm not gatekeeping any of this. I want you to be able to check it out. All right. So let's go back to the file set, the examples. I showed you the macro, the SWP. Next up, let's take a look at the add-in. So an add-in is going to have a full-blown Visual Studio solution, which I'm going to open up now. Amin, don't judge me because I'm still on Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition.
Oh no.
Actually, I don't even know what the latest Community Edition is. What is it?
We're still in 2022, but there's talks about 2026
Oh,
or 7.
oh, there you go. Also, no, I actually for CADSharp, I don't develop software full time anymore. I've been more into management over the past few years. But yeah, that's good to know that 2022 is the most recent version anyway, which actually touches on another point. With AI tools, there's a lot of newfangled versions of Visual Studio and advanced IDEs, that kind of thing. Me personally, I'm not saying you need to be like this. I tend to be a KISS guy, keep it simple, stupid. I've always liked the simplicity of the community edition because I can show students what I'm doing and then they know that they can go download that exact version, see the same thing. Even if I'm not using a lot of the bells and whistles, I don't really like them visible, present. So, yeah, actually, Amin, I'm curious, do you use Visual Studio Professional, Ultimate? What IDE do you typically use?
Obviously Visual Studio, but you could still write .NET applications with other IDEs that are out there by other
Do you still use the community edition though, or do you use like a advanced edition?
your organization size, so, right? So I think there's a limit to if you have an organization of a certain size, then above a certain revenue threshold, then you have to get Visual Studio Professional as a minimum. But yeah, that's the only thing that I would need to disclose here.
Okay, let's see. I do not know the answer to that question. I see that Deepak's already answered it. Yes, 2026 was just released. Okay, cool. All right. So here we are in the Visual Studio solution, and I love add-ins. Add-ins are so cool. Admittedly, they're kind of clunky. Like as you learn, if you learn how to make add-ins, which again I'm going to briefly pitch this on our website under developer guides. We have some really nice guides on how to write an add-in from scratch. If you want it, if you want to go through a written guide, I'm very proud of these guides. Very thorough, step by step, explain everything that's going on under the hood. And as fascinating as it is to create a SolidWorks add-in, you do become acutely aware as you learn how to create them of the fact that SolidWorks, even today, is still a 1990s Windows technology. So, when you write an add-in, it has to interface with COM, which is a 1990s technology. It's the precursor to .NET. And so, here you can see we have our COM visible tag, and we have our references to the SolidWorks API, and then the ISWN add-in SW add-in interface right there, implementing that. Of course, I don't have time to go through and explain what all this does. You can just look at a guide or a video that's out there already. But very generally, in order to get a SolidWorks add-in working, it's non-trivial. So of macro add-in and standalone, the add-in is going to be the most complicated to write, and that's the price you pay for the most professional integrated look. So, a VBA macro, you could say that's integrated into SolidWorks. It is. You can create a little macro toolbar or shortcut, which I'll just really briefly. Let's see if I even have one here already. I don't think I do, but you can. Oh, yeah, there you do. There I go. So from all the Swuggen presentations I was doing earlier this year, you can see where I was making macro shortcuts to the ones I was writing for them. That's as far as it gets with VBA macro integration. But an add-in, you can have its own ribbon menu. You can have drop-down menus like I'm using here. Here's a add-in I wrote for a customer, that kind of thing. Much more professional, but it all comes at the cost that you have to do a lot under the hood to get started. And those three things are, first of all, you have to give it a GUID, globally unique identifier. You have to make it visible. You have to implement the SW add-in interface, and then you have to register your add-in with COM. And we have some code related to that that's going to automatically create those registry keys when regasm.exe registers the add-in. And so an add-in requires kind of an installer of sorts, so it can mess with the registry, whereas a macro and a standalone don't. A lot more effort to get to this place where you can say you have a truly integrated professional product. And so all of this, and then here's some code just related to setting up the user interface, which I tend to default toward drop-down menus just because they're so clean. The code related to creating your own command manager section or tab is a bit messy. Yeah, all of this you're seeing is just like under the hood, just getting started so that you can finally open up a little user form. And then once the create block is clicked, it will again pass in the arguments and do the meat and potatoes code, which we already ran through. So you can see how VBA macro is effectively doing all of this for you under the hood. And then a standalone, you don't have to do that at all. But let's go ahead and run the add-in. So I already registered it. Let me show you how I would have done that though. Go into my tools. This is the world's simplest installer. You see where I have register.bat and unregister.bat. Those are batch files. They're basically text files. And if we right click on this and we go to edit in Notepad, that's it. World's simplest installer right there. So we're pointing to where regasm.exe is on the hard drive. That's what can register your DLL COM. And there's the relative path to my tools.dll. So I would have, prior to the presentation, compiled that DLL from the code in Visual Studio. And then, yeah, if I can actually register it again, I don't think it's going to hurt anything. So that's what you get. Types registered successfully. Press any key to continue. And then when you register, it's going to just say types unregistered successfully. All of that so that you can finally get to my tools appearing right there. Click create block. Same thing you saw before. Create block. There you go. So add-ins, if you want to view it as a stepping stone, like going from a macro, a VBA macro to a .NET add-in, it's not another step up. It's like a floor. It's like a flight of stairs up in terms of what you need to learn and understand, but totally worth it if you intend on using the SolidWorks API seriously. Let's see if there's anything else going on here in the chat. Microsoft is watching you. Oh, you better believe it. You better believe it.
And one little thing to add here, I noticed that some people might have this as a bit of an IT restriction is sometimes Well, in the case of registering the mytools.dll, I think if you ran the bat thing as an admin, right? So you need local Windows administration,
Hmm. Yeah, you
right?
absolutely do. So when I ran this last night to get set up, I right clicked, run as administrator. That's important. If you don't have permissions on the machine to access the registry, you will get some kind of permissions issue. Absolutely. Is there something being shared on a different screen? I don't think so.
No,
This is
you're good, Keith. You're good. I think we
okay.
got that sorted out.
Okay. Let's see. We've not missed a whole lot of videos on the website if you want to see it. And okay. All right, great. All right, so now let's go to the examples of standalones. Standalones are super cool. Man, I love standalones. I have a soft spot for add-ins, of course, but the cleanliness of standalones is hard to beat. And again, we'll talk in a moment over why you would pick one over the other. But let's start with, okay, make sure I'm back at the splash screen there. Start with the form standalone. Okay, so we're in the standalone and same thing. We have the SolidWorks VBA module, but you'll notice there's no main. There's no main module where we had to do all this prior setup. We don't have to register with COM. We can just create an exe and go. Yeah, you don't have to have an installer. I mean, if you're distributing an application, like, please have an installer. And also, please don't ever install programs to the user data folder. That's really lazy. Put it in the proper place in program files or whatever. I see a lot of people adding their add-ins or whatever standalone to just user data so they can escape the permissions issue. User data folder is supposed to literally be for user specific data. It's not supposed to be a location where you literally install programs. That's my opinion uh, anyway. But if you don't really want to mess with the permissions issues, standalones are great. And everything that you saw in the add-in, all that setup code has been replaced by this. Literally this line, activator.create instance, get type from prog ID, and then in this case, it should get the most recently opened window of SolidWorks. If you want to get into some more, complex situations where you're opening up specific versions you have installed on your computer, or if you want to get really complicated, you can actually generate or create multiple instances of SolidWorks and control them independently, like with the SolidWorks API. Really, really cool stuff, which we've done on the servers for like processing huge file sets, having like 10, 20 instances of SolidWorks running simultaneously to do some crazy processing. You can do all that. But here we're just keeping it really, really simple. Activator.create instance. Yeah, no com, no registration, all that good stuff. And then here's our meat and potatoes code. That's it. So I think, I could run it from there. I could debug and run it. But let's go back here to form. Bin stands for binary debug. mytools.exe. This is the compiled version. So this is just a Windows form that you can just open on your computer. You don't have to open it from within the context of SolidWorks. There's no integration, which sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't want that. Another pro and con. Let's click create block. And what it did is it connected with the most recently open version of SolidWorks, or if I didn't have SolidWorks open, it would have created a new instance on my computer. So that's using a Windows form I created in Visual Studio. Right here, you can see that. We had also created the same form in the add-in. All right, and then lastly, this is one of the coolest ways to use standalones, you don't even need to have a Windows form. You can have a console application that gets run from the command line. This is super useful if you're doing some kind of processing on a server. You don't need to worry about a UI. I love this stuff. This is when it gets really fancy, really cool. So if we go here to my tools, if I were to just double click on this, yeah, you see how it just pops up and is gone. That's because you can't run it like that. That's not the point. There's no form that's going to pop up. Instead, what we're going to do is I'm going to type in CMD and I'm going to drag this in here. And I know, I'll show you the code in a moment, but I know that this takes 3 arguments, 555. I'm just going to keep putting that in. That's the millimeters there. And I'm going to hit enter. See how it connected and created that block again. And I think you can imagine the power of that. And if we open the code for this, let's go back. All right, so now we do have a main module again. And you can see this is just standard.NET. This is anything SolidWorks API specific, but this is basically the code that's going to accept the command line arguments from the environment you can imagine, and then it's going to run SolidWorks.createBlock, which is that meat and potatoes code I keep referring to, and I don't even think this is being used. That was just or no, it is. But anyway, there's the same code, so you can see how they all 3 of these or all 4 of these programs I've shown have different starting points, so to speak, but you all always end up in the same type of code, which raises another question. People ask, are there API calls that can only be used in one program type or another? And the answer is SolidWorks functionality related? No, not really. It's pretty much universal. You can always use an API call in all 4. However, there are API calls that might be used more commonly in add-ins, for example, because they're user interface related. Just things like that. It's typically when you're creating a standalone, it's either going to not have a UI, like in the case of this console application, or in the case of a form application, you're going to be creating your own Windows form, which I'll just throw this out here. No shade against the SolidWorks API development team, but man, creating property manager pages with SolidWorks API code is pretty tedious. In fact, Amin, you remember this back when
Oh
you
man,
were
memory lane,
working with
man.
CADSharp. Can I mention that you created that PMP
Oh,
builder?
absolutely. Go for it.
Amin created this whole tool where you could go in and drag and drop. It was a WYSIWYG editor. You can drag and drop what you wanted your
As a
property
matter
manager page to look
of
like, and
fact,
then you
if you
could
guys
click
go to Cat,
generate code. Oh, it's
right,
still
as a
there?
matter of fact, if you guys go to the CADSharp YouTube channel, you'll see what that video, I think, is still up there, right? But to Keith's point, using the property, the manager page is an absolute it's an absolute, I don't know, waste of time, but it's just there's a lot of boilerplate
It's
code that you have to implement, right? And it's very
it is.
discouraging for new developers. So maybe SolidWorks will think about reimagining that. Maybe not. We'll see. If we get enough votes on the enhancement portal on the 3D Experience platform, then we might get the R&D team attention. But I'll put something out there, and you guys are more than welcome to upvote it and we can carry that momentum forward and simplify the property manager page. Thank you for mentioning that, Keith. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm
Grievances
not
here.
gonna hold, I'm not gonna hold out on them making a change there. Like at this point, I kind of referenced an earlier program I had written. It's Narsco Tools, like it has a full blown PMP with within different. Actually, let's see if just really
Oh, I
quickly.
remember that one. Yes.
Yeah, this is the only program that I've modified over the years. I won't go into exactly what it does for proprietary reasons, but basically, like this is a property manager page. You have to create everything. I mean, the fact that this says message and then this little yellow box and then this section that says entire turnout and then if you click down here and do single tie, all the options, you have to specify every single control as well as the logic behind it. And so if I were to show you that code, it's huge. It's absolutely huge, very tedious, and you can circumvent all that through a standalone or through an add-in that just generates a Windows form. And that's exactly what I did here. It's just this is easier to create. I can create that form in Visual Studio. The disadvantage is it doesn't look SolidWorks native, but I've never had anyone complain about that. Like in my 15 years of SolidWorks API development, I'd say 95% of the time when a customer asks for an add-in, I just told them, hey, I'm going to do a drop-down menu with a user form. And they said, okay. Like, I don't even offer them. I'm not like, hey, would you like a property manager page so it looks like a native SolidWorks experience? I don't even give them the option. I just say, this is what I'm going to do. And if they insist on a property manager page, like they have to mention it.
Right. Yeah, I would
So,
just add to that that this property manager page is more for UX, like the UI UX experience. If you're writing something that's going to be used by hundreds, if not thousands of user, just for usability purposes, it just is well tightly integrated within the user interface, within the
mhm.
SolidWorks interface. You want to opt for that. But to your point, Keith, I actually did find the PMP Sandbox video on the CADSharp YouTube channel. Just pasted it here on the channel on the chat for everybody to see. So that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of Min's first projects. Right. So yeah, there's pros and cons there. How integrated you want it to be. Somebody asked, the batch file is generated itself or you write it every time? That's a great question. I did create that batch file myself, created a text file, and then renamed it as a .bat. In Visual Studio, there is a place. So when you're debugging it from Visual Studio, there is a way to um, yeah, it's been a while since I've been here. Debug command line arguments. So you can use this as the location where you want to register your add-in with COM. I don't do that because it's just kind of creates extra headaches. I'm a separation of concerns guy. Like when I click run on my add-in, all I want it to do is run my add-in to debug it. I don't want it also acting as an installer at the same time. I guess that's theoretically convenient, but I prefer to just manually install slash uninstall my add-in when
I
I'm done using it.
I agree to this approach. You just have more control. But for those who actually want to use a more, I guess I don't want to say streamlined, but fewer files, I think in the Visual Studio project properties, I think the application tab, Keith, if you can cycle back to Visual Studio, it's probably either the compile the application, so probably then the compile if we can go there. Second tab from the top, right?
Oh, come on. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And then there is, if you scroll all the way at the bottom, there should be an option here called register for COM interrupt for add-ins that allows you to be able to register, right? Without
Yeah,
using the bat file, but it's disabled since we have a console
yeah,
up here.
it's a standard. Yeah. Yep. So I've historically avoided that just purely for the separation concerns reason. But yeah, there's pros and cons to all that. Let's see. Pretty sure. Yep. Massive pan. That's absolutely true. Okay. Yep. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for stopping by. All right. So those are examples. Let's just run through some comments real quick on pros and cons now that you've seen them, and then we'll wrap it up here. All right. So I'm not gonna I'm not gonna cover every bit of info on these slides, but I think you already get that, like macro and add-in. They run within the SOLIDWORks exe process. The standalone doesn't. Why would you want that flexibility? Standalone's going to let you control multiple programs easily. Like with a standalone, you can view as your program as the master and SolidWorks as the servant. So it's like SolidWorks could be closed or even, dare I say, crash, and your standalone doesn't close. Whereas with an add-in, SolidWorks is the master, your add-in is the servant. If SolidWorks closes or crashes, then your add-in closes or crashes, that kind of thing. I think you can get that. So the flexibility there with standalones is you can control multiple programs simultaneously, or you can just be kind of outside of the SolidWorks ecosystem there, which is sometimes valuable, but of course not integrated. It may not create the user experience you want. Let's see, I'm going to skip on those next two. So that's topic of integration and flexibility as it relates to program types. Ease of development. I think this is where we can start getting into recommendations. I can kind of summarize all of this by just saying, if you want a quick and dirty sandbox to test out API calls, you can use a VBA macro. But honestly, once you have a standalone setup that's just connecting to the existing session and maybe the existing part, it's pretty easy to use a .NET standalone as a sandbox for testing API calls before, creating a little function or a little bit of code before you then migrate it into your main program. So standalones, technically harder than macros, but if you write a macro and your standalone is in .NET, you have to convert from VBA to .NET. And yeah, sometimes it's easier to just use the standalone as kind of a sandbox. So add-ins, though, are messy to develop in because generally, there are some exceptions to this. I'm not going to get into it. But generally, when you're debugging in an add-in, every time you want to make changes to the code and then recompile and retest the add-in, you have to completely restart SolidWorks, since it has to reload the DLL into memory there, into RAM. Again, there are some exceptions, not going to get into that though in this talk. And then obviously a macro, VBA macro, you have that in development environment already installed, the VB editor, but downloading, installing Visual Community isn't a huge deal for add-ins and standalones. On the topic of ease of distribution, administration, of course, macros, there's no installation required. Add-in, yes. Standalone is, you can have an install wizard just to make it look professional, but yeah, you can, if you really want, just distribute the exe. Add-ins, I would say, are best for running on startup. There are ways to modify a SolidWorks shortcut so it will run a macro on startup, but I think it's pretty janky. I wouldn't recommend going down that path unless you're the sole user of the macro or something. Otherwise, that can get into an admin mess trying to make sure all your coworkers are using a specific startup shortcut so that your macro gets run on startup. Good for commercial distribution. Obviously, something written in .NET is going to be more professional than a VBA macro you're passing around. Although you can password protect macros, you can also crack them. In fact, I have a blog article on my website about how to
I
crack
also
them.
have a blog article on cracking.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. And then macro features. I think you can use macro features with add-ins, in fact, but macro features are kind of the pinnacle of the SolidWorks API. That's a custom feature you can create. That's a whole bear. Most people aren't going to be writing macro features though, so not worth spending a whole lot of time there. All right, program types in terms of performance. This is real simple. Macros and add-ins, since they run into the SolidWorks process, they're going to be faster. That should be pretty obvious. There's no boundary layer that's being crossed there, like with a standalone. Also, this is cool. Another reason you might use a standalone is you can run SolidWorks invisibly, which, as soon as you remove the GPU from the equation when performing certain tasks, certain batch processing tasks, man, your software, your processor can fly. Absolutely fly. And I think you can probably get two, three, four times the speed for certain tasks versus if you're watching it visually. All right. And then language. So I'm not going to go over COM versus .NET. I explained that they're both underlying frameworks within Microsoft so the programs can talk to one another. And COM is the 1990s technology basically that Microsoft used. And then in the 2000s, they came out with .NET. That's still what's being used today. But since SolidWorks was written in the 90s, it's still COM software. And that's why we have to make our .NET software, our .NET add-ins talk to COM. Or yeah, the SolidWorks API is just COM based in general. Languages, ease of development. No matter what language you end up using, you got to know how to read VBA just because so many SolidWorks API examples are in VBA. So, at least understand it for that reason. But then as far as actually developing, again, going back to development experience as a custom software developer in the space, vast majority of the code we're writing is in .NET for a variety of reasons. And one of the biggest reasons, honestly, is just so you can use source control more easily. You can't really use source control with VBA. You could, but you're always going to be, um, submitting or committing these compiled files and yeah, it's not normally how you'd want to use source control. You want to be able to compare the actual code being added or removed or whatever. All right. Yeah, and .NET, of course, is object oriented, so you just have a more powerful language in general. And I'm going to skip over the security aspect, but I think you can imagine how .NET is going to be a bit more secure. Obviously, it's going to be a lot harder to crack and decompile and kind of reverse engineer a .NET um, add-in or standalone, which I'll also say I'm not real big on obfuscation or security licensing, making sure nobody ever sees my code. That's for a pretty simple reason. There's not a lot of people on earth that know how to use SolidWorks API. So it's like you can't just reverse engineer a DLL we've created for someone. You also actually have to know what it means. And so there's just kind of that built-in security. I've certainly in my 15 years never really been worried about somebody taking code and then going off and doing something better. In fact, that's why when we write code for someone in a bespoke situation, we just give them the code. We just say it's yours, and we're so confident in the level of quality we provide as developers that we know they'll probably come back. But if they wanted to keep modifying it themselves, they're more than welcome to. But yeah, 99% of the time they don't know how. All right. Extra interoperability layer is going to be there with .NET versus VBA and C++. So technically .NET is a little bit slower, but this is pretty minor. It's not that's not why you would typically decide between one of those. So all this being said, let's really get down to the bottom line here. I still recommend learning the SolidWorks API with VBA. I think Amin would agree with that. I know you've been on a VBA kick. There's just a lot of good reasons why it's simplest to learn with that. But then once you know the SolidWorks API, then you can kind of focus on learning a .NET language or yeah, even C++ if you really wanted to. But I think that's still an appropriate stepping stone even in 2025. Like when you're learning the SolidWorks API, learn the SolidWorks API. And then when you're ready to learn more advanced language, learn that more advanced language, and then marry the two together. Don't try to do all of that at once. And yeah, I believe, yeah, my course is in VBA. Min, I'm sure, has learning resources in VBA. It's just I think an appropriate way to approach it. But if you already know .NET very, very well, okay, that's a good reason why you might skip over learning it in VBA, or even if you were watching some of our content, you could just convert it there to .NET on the spot.
Just to
All
add
right,
here, VBA
go
is the
ahead.
best way to test or sandbox your API calls. If there is a new API call that was introduced, let's say in 2026, 2027, and you want a quick, dirty way to be able to test that in an example, I personally would never use like C Sharp or VB.NET. I'd open SolidWorks, I create a new macro, copy maybe some of the examples that are in the API help, or I'll write my own simple VBA macro to test things out. So yeah, VBA is the, let's just call it the rite of passage, right? For any API developer, you gotta start with VBA for sure.
Yep. So, yeah, those are some exceptions. I say I strongly recommend you learn the SolidWorks API with VBA. Even if your production language is .NET or C++, you will save time in the long run. In production, not a huge fan of VBA macros. We kind of went over all the reasons for security, integration, et cetera. It just looks a little bit more professional. But if you're just like a solo developer, you're the only one that's going to use your program. Okay, that's fine. You can create a macro shortcut. Maybe just you and a coworker. VST macros we're not going to go over. As I mentioned, nobody really uses those anymore. C++, some people will be like, hey, I back in the day, I used C++. I'm going to use C++. Probably would not recommend that. There's not, it is harder to use the SolidWorks API in C++. You're getting minimal performance benefit. Yeah, I would only use C++ if you are like truly a programming wizard. You are a bona fide developer. You know exactly what you're doing. Otherwise, it's not an advantage. You're not gaining much there. I'd
And
recommend learning .NET, the
right.
more modern languages.
And Keith, a lot of the time, it's mostly about maintaining something that was written in C++, right? So that's most of the like 90% of the cases that people would have to learn C++ is to
That's
maintain other code that was written maybe 15, 20 years ago for using the SOLIDWORKS API. That's
so
pretty
so
much
that's
it.
an interesting point. I will say to that, what we do at CADSharp a lot is rewrite people's software. They come to us and say, hey, we have that old piece of software that Joe Schmo 15, 20 years ago wrote, and you recently left the company. We're kind of screwed now or something. And we'll quote them, and like 90% of the time, we'll be like, hey, Joe, I'm sure he is a great guy, but he obviously didn't know what he was doing programming wise. If you want to carry this into the future and this be a serious, robust piece of software, can we please rewrite it? And most of the time, the customer will say yes. So I'm not saying you have to rewrite some legacy software, but that's something we do a lot. There's advantages to it. Yes, as Amin alluded to, though, sometimes you don't have that option. Sometimes you do have to support something in C++, but don't be afraid to rewrite things either if you have the bandwidth and the wherewithal. All right, so here's kind of what it all boils down to for me. The vast majority of all SolidWorks API projects fall into these three categories. VBA macro, again, mostly for sandbox testing, learning, and then .NET add-in or .NET standalone. So if you want to get into API, you got to learn a little bit of VBA. You're going to have to learn .NET, and then you should know the difference between those three program types, which hopefully you've gotten that a little bit better now from this presentation. So I'm going to skip over the case studies. Does anyone have any questions? Any more questions?
All right. I was watching the chat and throughout the presentation, just trying to collect some of the questions, which some of them were already answered. I think Mike Buchanan has already left, but he was asking VSDA versus VBA, any advantages of one over the other?
Well, the advantage would be that you get to use .NET and you can
Right,
use source control, but as we discussed, VSTA is basically
right.
deprecated at this point, so it doesn't matter.
Okay. My buddy Garrett here from Hawkridge did us the favor of finding the support article from the knowledge base, the SOLIDWORKS knowledge base, saying that VSDA 3.0 is supported, but the old one 1.0 is not supported anymore. So thank you for that correction, Garrett. Now we know that VSDA is still
I,
supported, but just the
I
latest one, 3.0.
yeah, that was my understanding. I remember
Right.
that too. So technically possible, still not recommended though.
Right, right. I think there was another question that was slightly outside the scope of what we're are presenting here, but I'll skip that one over. I think AC Miguel, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was asking if the .bat, the bat file, is generated by itself, or you have to write that every time. I think Keith, you already answered that, right?
Yeah, I touched on that already. So.
Right. And then we're still looking at the chat here, so if there are any questions, please feel free to do so. I think Garrett also mentioned that if you're sending a support ticket to SolidWorks, then the best way to reproduce the bug or get an answer to your question is to write a simple VBM macro. It's just the quickest way to go about
Yep,
it.
since in the code snippet they can actually just use right away. Don't just
Right.
give them a
Keith, we
random
have
line from a piece. Go ahead.
absolutely. We have another question from Jeremy. How can you overcome the admin issue of the .NET add-in? I've tried many online tutorial steps step to step, but once I run the program, I still get the admin issue.
Let's
So I
see.
think he's talking about running things as admin. He's I think Jeremy's working with an environment that is restricted, probably because of IT. And Jeremy, if you can just
Yeah,
expand on that a little in the chat.
yeah, it's exactly what Amin said. I mean, that's an IT issue at the end of the day. It's
What
not
what
a
what
SolidWorks
I would
API issue.
suggest perhaps is to get IT to get you some sort of sandbox, either a computer in your network, or ideally, if you have the resources, just to spin up a virtual machine where everything is contained, sandbox, you can do whatever you want, and then that contained environment, what you can just put files there and test things out, and you'll be able to have admin access. I think Keith, that would be your recommendation as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Another question here from Ganesh. From your experience, which automation approach is more stable for heavy workflows? A SolidWorks add-in running inside the application, or a standalone comp-based tool? And under which conditions does each approach pose a higher risk of causing SolidWorks to crash?
So for heavy workflows, again, if we're talking about heavy in the sense of you're going to be running a huge amount of files through the workflow for processing purposes, say on a server or something, like it just makes more sense to do a standalone. And if SolidWorks crashed, you can actually check for that and then boot up SolidWorks again and pick up where you left off. We've done that. We've written processor software that's basically identifying for that event and then recreating the instance. If you're talking heavy though in the sense of a user needs to be able to automate parts of their daily workflow while they're using SolidWorks, then yeah, you're gonna have to go with an add-in. It really boils down to the integration experience you want and how you're defining heavy workflow. So it could be either,
Right.
but hopefully that example makes sense. Like if you just need to let's say you have to change the title block on thousands and thousands of drawings or something, which maybe you can already do that with existing software out there. But maybe let's say you have a really custom use case and it's kind of non-interactive. You're just processing a huge file set. Yeah, I mean, I would just make a standalone, wouldn't you? And then
I absolutely agree with you 100%. You can that's just the perfect answer right there. It feels like you were looking over my shoulder 3 days ago because I was actually wrote something like that to change the title block of a number of files. I would absolutely pick standalone over add-in if I'm doing a batch process of a huge number of files. The only thing I'll add on top of that is that if you are writing this standalone that is going to launch SolidWorks and process thousands of files, you might wanna restart SolidWorks every maybe 100, 200 files because SOLIDWORKS has a tendency to run out of memory very quickly. That's something I've seen in my experience. Also, sometimes SOLIDWORKS doesn't like one part or a drawing and it just freezes. So you'll have to implement or use some sort of they're called resilience framework in .NET. Poly is a really good one that allows you to have like a circuit breaker type of logic that allows you to kill SolidWorks if your unit of work, for example, exceeds like 5 minutes, so that it crashes SolidWorks on purpose, puts that file in your logs, right, and then jumps into the next one in the next item in
Yeah.
the iteration. I'm pretty sure Keith, when he mentioned the example of having multiple instances of SolidWorks on a server running, they used techniques like the one I'm describing right now. I have another question. We did have 5 likes. I think
Yeah, I
Amber
see
says
it.
here, thanks, Keith and Ahmad. My question is a bit outside main topic, but I wanted to get your thoughts on the future of CAD APIs. It seems like the cloud-based tools such as Onshape API are becoming more reliable and might be where the industry is heading compared to the traditional options like the SolidWorks API. What do you think?
Yep. So you're talking to the right person. CADSharp, as far as I know, is deeper than in the on shape automation world than just about anyone. And our top developer for quite a while, who had a huge amount of experience with SolidWorks macro features, also ended up becoming extremely knowledgeable in the area of on-shape feature scripts. So we've seen a strong, we see the pros and cons between the two. I'll also just pitch this. We have a course for on-shape feature script as well on our website if you want to check it out and actually see the differences. I'll say this though about SolidWorks and on-shape. It's whether you use one API slash feature script. Onshape feature script isn't technically API. Whether you use Onshape's automation capabilities or SolidWorks capabilities, that's probably not going to be the driving factor. It's just going to be which software is your company using, and then you're going to just use that. But I will also say that feature script is way easier to use than macro features. So that's an example of a definite step up, a definite evolution over SolidWorks. Like everything in SolidWorks you had to do to create a macro feature is effortless with Onshape feature script. On the
Mm.
other hand, using the Onshape API you have to create a web app and then you have to host it. So using the Onshape API is in essence way more complicated and much more of an effort than using the SolidWorks API. If you don't want to get into web development, you don't want to mess with hosting, like even if you were writing something for yourself in Onshape that you're going to use just personally, you'd have to host it on your own machine. It gets messy there. So there's pros and cons. Onshape's really cool software. I'd say it's the best cloud-based CAD software. SolidWorks, in my opinion, is still hands down the best desktop-based CAD software. I'm not team one or the other. I think they're both great. But it would be false to say that Onshape is just universally across the board this new superior evolution of CAD automation. That's that's not true.
Right.
Feature script is really cool, but the SolidWorks API is also extremely robust, extremely powerful, and once you get good with it, you can write incredibly powerful software quickly. And yeah, a lot of it will just come down to which CAD software your company chooses to use.
Yeah, I will add that in my experience, I can't think of a better, most comprehensive CAD API than the desktop SolidWorks one.
Hmm.
Obviously, the whole industry, not just CAD, everything is moving into to the cloud, so that question has already been answered, right? And that's what SolidWorks is well has with the 3D Experience platform. That it does have its own APIs, but I'm pretty sure that things are heading in that direction. But
Which, by the way, people might be wondering with 3D Experience, SolidWorks connected, all that. Am I still going to be able to use the SolidWorks API as I've just demoed it? And the answer is yes. Like when
yes,
I present last year I did the my presentation, my hands-on presentation on creating an add-in from
Mm.
scratch. We still did that with SolidWorks connected. You have to connect to SolidWorks online, of course, have a internet connection, but nothing else is fundamentally changing. And so if anybody's wondering, what I've shown you, is this going to go away in a few years with the 3D experience platform? The answer is no, at very least, because there's such a massive amount of legacy software out there that
Right.
uses these kind of technologies. It's kind of like with Microsoft. They're going to keep VBA around forever because VB6 has to stay around forever. There's just so much legacy
Right.
code there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. VBA will still, it still will continue to be around a strong and alive and well. I don't think we have any more questions. I think I'll just use the next couple minutes here to wrap things up here. This was an awesome presentation, Keith. Thank you so much for making this happen. We're so great to have you, and we hope that we could have some more presentation on the topics of the API. And I know you have a lot on your end. We could do future ones. As far as announcement goes, I do have an upcoming user group meeting December 3rd. So please mark that on your calendar and RSVP on the SolidWorks community, the user group community page. It's going to be a little bit more code centric, 30 or 30 tips and tricks of the SolidWorks API in under 45 minutes. So it will be quick tips, about 1 to 2 minutes for each tip, just going over the best practices for writing VBM macros. Also, you could see us at the 3D Experience World, right, Keith?
Yep,
We
I should be there.
It should be there. I think Keith has two presentations. The first one is called SolidWorks API for total beginners. That's, I think, on the second day, Tuesday, February 3rd from 2:30 p.m. Central Time. So make sure if you are attending the 3D Experience World in Houston to check that out. Also, another presentation, Keith. You're on a roll, buddy, here. Macros versus add-ins versus standalone, which what we have here today, right? The same.
Yep.
That's going to be on Wednesday, February 4th at 8:30 Central Time. But I will also be presenting for the first time at the 3D Experience World, but around the topic of the PDM API. So if you use SolidWorks, but you also use the SolidWorks PDM API and you want to get the some tips on how to be more efficient as a programmer with the SolidWorks PDM API, then I would love to have you come to my presentation at 3D Experience World. I think mine is going to be on Wednesday, February 3rd, around 8:30 a.m. Central Time. So it's going to be a master class and best practices and workflows on the PDM API. I don't have anything else to add here. Keith, do you have anything else to add?
Nope, I don't think so. Appreciate
All
the
right,
opportunity.
wonderful. Absolutely. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And now we'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.
Bye.